I'm Yoram Peri, Kate Professor of Israel Studies and the Director of the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies. And I'm one of the two partners, I'll introduce my other partner, to this event. It's already a week since the ceasefire between Israel and Gaza, or the Hamas, started after a very long war, 46 days, one of the longest wars that Israel had, and one of the most terrible wars that Israel and the Palestinians have. The wars today, in our times, are mediatized wars. We see the pictures, and we look at the images. And these pictures or images or photos that we saw from the war in Gaza were really devastating, really devastating. They were terrible. They were so horrible to see the suffering of civilians on both sides of the fence. To me personally, being an Israeli, my family came in the late 80s, 1865 to be more precise. It has been the 10th war. But I was never so devastated as I was in this particular war. And only one of the reasons is the picture of the children and old people and young people, both Palestinians and Jews, who suffered from the war. But the pictures, as much as they have their impact, are misleading in a way, because they do not have a context. The images of the television do not have a historical depth to them. And the messages that are transferred rapidly on the social media are in many cases manipulated. So what is really needed is a much serious, more depth analysis of that particular war. I'll give you just one example when I talk about context and deep analysis. For many of you, particularly the new students, it was the first war that you watched between Israel and people who live in Gaza, correct? But that wasn't the first war. We had wars in 2006, 2008, 2012, and now 2014. In each one of the wars before, there were civilian casualties, both on the Israeli side and the Palestinian side, usually more on the Palestinian side, but there were civilian casualties. So there isn't something new in that. If you don't know the context, you misread the photos. But these were wars, I started mentioning only from 2006, but there were 10 wars before. And many of the wars before were not between Jews and Palestinians. The war of 48, 56, 67, 73 were between Israel and Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, even Sudan, Iraq. It's only since the first Intifada that the conflict is concentrated between Jews and Palestinians. If you don't see the entire picture, you might misunderstand the story. I'm not going to judge anybody, but what I argue is that there's really a need for deep understanding. And I'm afraid that we don't find that very common. By the way, we have a fantastic course. Now it's the ed part. We have a wonderful course this year that started yesterday morning, which is a unique one that deals with the source of the problem, namely 1948, the War of Independence, as the Jews call it, the Nakba, as the Palestinians call it. And it will be, it's a small group of students both here and elsewhere, and they will be involved also in research in the National Archive. So if any of you want to join it, it's still time to, we're looking for 3 more people to make it an interesting group, and I really recommend it. So because of the controversy of the war, and it did create a lot of tension on all sides, both in Israel, in Palestine, in the Arab world, in Europe, in the United States, in campuses, outside campuses, we thought that we should try and do something else today. Paul Shem, Professor Shem from the Gildenhorn Institute, gave us a wonderful idea. Instead of bringing experts who will talk to you for 20 minutes, and will let you, in the last 5 minutes, ask a question and a half, let you talk. Let's hear what you feel, what your ideas, what's your impressions, what you want to understand more. and the experts will answer you, will relate to you. They will listen to you and will relate to you. We ask them not to prepare written speeches. They will answer your questions if you have questions and relate to your concerns if you have concerns. So this is what we are planning to do. And there are two conditions that it will work well. I think the first one I don't even have to mention, but I wrote to myself because I wasn't sure how it will go, that we are expecting a polite meeting. We're expecting respectful approach to each other. You can say whatever you want if it's within the limits of civility. The second condition is that it will have to be short. We want to have as many people talking as possible, and we'll give preference to students. But it has to be short. So we thought that it will be 2 minutes each, which is a long time. 2 minutes is 250 words, which is a full page, for A4 double space, which is more or less half of an op-ed in a newspaper. If you speak precisely, you can express yourself in half an op-ed, and if it's good, we'll recommend you to write it as an op-ed with 400 words later. So these are the two conditions. The panelists are Professor Shibley Telhami, who co-hosts with us this event, and I don't have to present him at large. You all know him, if not from the university, you know him from the television, because he appears every other evening there. He is the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development, and a real Middle East expert. I call him Mr. Middle East in Washington. And I really thank him for helping us to organize this event. The other two speakers are colleagues of us who just came for this year to join us for a year as visiting professors. The first one is Professor Ariel Bendor, who is an expert on law and war on terrorism. He was the Dean of Law School at Haifa University, then moved to Bar Ilan University, and he has a course today with us. Unfortunately, I cannot recommend it because he has already a long waiting list. He has a course on the war against terrorism and the law, international law, and law in general. And the other one is a very interesting guy. His name is Shlomi Eldar. He was for 20 years the correspondent of the Israeli television in Gaza. An Israeli Jew who covered Gaza from Gaza for 20 years. And I was jokingly told somebody that he knows the Hamas better than the leaders of the Hamas know themselves. He published a wonderful book in Hebrew a year ago, which is now being translated, so hopefully you'll see it this year. But before the book will be out, we're going to have another meeting with him in which he will show an unbelievable film that he made some 2 or 3 years ago. We'll talk about it later. So these are the panelists. I will ask Shibley Telhami to start with a short presentation. Oh, sorry, Khaled, sorry. That's because you were late a little. Sorry. Next year, come and join us as a visiting professor, so I'll mention you as first one. Khaled El-Jidni is a former advisor to the Palestinian Authority, a guy who knows well the conflict from both sides of the coin, both being practitioner, working with politicians during the negotiations with Israel, as an academician or scholar, researcher at the Brookings Institute, where he spent the last several years. So thank you very much, Khaled, for coming to see us, and I again apologize for being too excited, and not so excited as I want to save time, because I want really to let you talk at length. And Shibley, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. So I'm also going to make some brief comments, and I appreciate co-hosting this event with Yoram, Peri, and Israel Studies. I just want to say that I'm going to provide just a few points of reference to start the conversation. But I'm always conscious, as a person who studies this very difficult issue, and doing it for years, that while we all have moral positions on each one of these difficult questions, particularly when we see wars and casualties, that my role as a scholar and my edge as a scholar isn't my moral position, because I don't have an edge over any of you, or none of us do. So while the moral should be part of the conversation, that's not what experts bring to bear. I could tell you how I think about it when I pass judgment, if that helps. But the reality of it is, what we really need is to understand the context and the facts, and a way of addressing and understanding where we go from here. I mean, what we've seen was a horrific series of events over the past few weeks that have been very painful to watch for almost everyone. And you don't have to be Jewish or Arab or Muslim or Christian, a human being. When you watch the atrocity, we've been watching too many atrocities across the entire region, from ISIS to what's happening in Syria to everywhere else. It's been very painful to watch. And when you add this to what we've seen in Gaza, it's been very difficult to watch. So everybody has an emotional position and a moral position, as we all should, as citizens of the world. But I don't think that's the beginning of the conversation for us. We're experts to the extent that we can weigh in. We'll weigh in from the point of view of fact and context. I'm just going to make a couple of points related to the Gaza war. Number one is that I'm just going to remind everyone that it isn't the source of the problem that we face now. It was a symptom of a bigger problem that preceded before. The day before that war, everybody was saying, well, there may be an eruption. There may even be a third intifada, because there was a collapse in the peace negotiations. There was a pessimism across the board among Israelis and Palestinians. All the polls, including the ones I've done, said that the majority of Israelis, majority of Palestinians don't think peace was even possible anymore. And occupation wasn't over. The Palestinians were in difficult shape, whether it was in Gaza or in the West Bank, but particularly in Gaza, even before the war, and Israel didn't have security. So the bottom line is, this was a symptom. So don't think that if we address this issue, we've addressed it. Back to square one isn't a good place, and that's where we were before, and we have to remember that. Second, when the war started, I tweeted, we already know the outcome. It will be lose-lose, with disproportionate losses for the Palestinians and no security for Israel. And it wasn't that hard to predict that, because we've been at it over and over again. Every time people think it's going to be different the next round. There have been 4 rounds every 2 years, if you include the Hezbollah war in 2006, 2008, 2006, 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, and listen to the rhetoric now. Let's do it better next time. They're getting ready for the next round to predict that somehow they're going to be able to solve it through military force. It certainly hasn't happened. So clearly that isn't what you're going to have. Third, some of the debate that you see, forgetting about the cause and effect, that obviously is something that you're all welcome to comment on, ask questions about. We'll happy to answer you. But you already hear the discourse about who loses and who wins. In my own opinion, there are no winners here. There are only losers. But that's an opinion, and we can discuss it. But I can tell you that winning and losing is also a function of perceptions and expectations. And so when you look at how it is being perceived, there is no question that there is more a sense that Israel has lost and Hamas has won, even though Hamas has been devastated, and actually Gaza has been certainly devastated, mostly civilians. But nonetheless, if you look at the Israeli public opinion polls, majority think that Israel didn't win the war. Among Palestinians, yesterday a big poll was released. It was quite the opposite. Overwhelming majority of Palestinians think that Israel was defeated, Hamas won. So you have a public perception of winning and losing that is important in this debate, but it doesn't change the reality on the ground, obviously. It's all a question of perception. And the final point I want to make, and that's something that might be worth thinking about, is, while wars are horrific, and they are, they also create a sense of urgency that didn't exist before. They reshuffle the deck, not usually in a predictable fashion necessarily, but they create the possibility of change where change wasn't possible. It so happened that I was out there in the region when first the 3 Israelis were taken hostage and then unfortunately killed. And then the Palestinian was taken hostage and was burned to death. And I happened to be, just before that, on my way to Ramallah, meeting with a prominent Israeli journalist who was depressed about the absence of peace among Israelis and Palestinians, and saying that in her own view, the problem was the absence of urgency, that most Israelis didn't feel the need to do something. Even Obama said, in his comment to Tom Friedman, Netanyahu was too strong to compromise, Israel was too comfortable. Well, there was also a sense in some ways on the West Bank of a little bit of relaxation. Well, this created an urgency. The question is, where will this urgency lead? That's one question that I think is worth talking about. We invite your comments and questions, and remember, we're experts, not moralizers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shibley. All right, who is going to be the first? Please introduce yourself, and if you are members of any organization, student group, or whatever, let us know which one. Here we are. 2 minutes, 400 words. Seconds. What?
I need 30 seconds.
Up to 2 minutes.
Not Israeli, not Jewish, not Arab, not Muslim, but interested in political affairs, and hopefully the solutions will be political. So from that, my question to the panel is, how is it impacting the Israeli politics and Palestinian politics? And if there is to be an election in Palestine in particular, how will this impact the future going in? From the perception of victory by Hamas, as the professor says, how is that going to impact the PA and the Fatah?
Fine, thank you. Yes, question, comment, idea? Over there. Thank you.
My name is Evan Lewis. I'm a graduate student at the University of Maryland, and I work with the program on international policy attitudes. And I've actually participated in some of the polling that has been done with Shibley Telhami. And my question leads to something that you alluded to in your initial comments, was the notion of a peace process and whether this creates some urgency. I've heard that there's been some studies that have been done regarding the issue of empathy and how the more Israelis and Palestinians have separated, the more there has been a lack of empathy. And I'm wondering how this is influencing the likelihood of a two-state solution, because there was increased interest in a possible one-state solution, and at least from my perspective, the wars keep escalating more and more and more, and the likelihood of a one-state solution seems less and less and less.
Thank you. Another one. Yes, please. Here. Greg, we have here.
Hi there. I'm Greg. I'm Greg Minton. I'm at UMD. I'm a student. And I want to ask about a couple points. And I've got notes. It is short, though.
That's fine.
So I was troubled by an op-ed in the Times of Israel. It was an online one called "When Genocide is Permissible." I'm sure you saw it shared on social media. And then Moshe Feiglin, I think is how you pronounce him, deputy speaker in the Israeli parliament in the Knesset, he put out a proposal for the concentration and extermination of Palestinians in Gaza. So at what point do these sort of genocidal impulses become something really worth containing and
I haven't seen it. He did use the word extermination?
His proposal was, I don't know if he used...
Sorry?
I don't know if he used the word extermination, but yeah, he put a proposal. Maybe others can...
It was quite extraordinary.
It was, yes.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Yes, please. Oh, next to you.
Hi, my name is Zachary. I'm a freshman here. I have a question. My question is that what about this war exacerbated the anti-Semitism in Europe and the United States?
My name is Carla Abdo. I'm a doctoral candidate in government and politics. I focus on the Middle East. And I have a question for how this war relates to domestic Israeli politics. Parliamentarian Eilat Shaked said something similar in terms of Palestinians being little snakes. They should be killed, and then why is everyone not seeing this? This should be obvious. So at what point in time, really, does war behavior affect domestic rhetoric, and how does that affect the average Israeli citizen?
Fine, thank you. I'm willing to hear some positions and not only questions. Talk about your
stick with questions. We have questions. We can answer them now. So
is it okay that I had a question?
And we'll take two or three more. We'll take 2 or 3 more, and then we'll have a round of answers, and then we'll have another one. But don't be shy to present your opinion.
Well, is it okay that I have a question besides this one? Well, what I was going to ask was, when I was in Israel over winter break, I heard a talk that was talking about how recent sanctions in Iran being lifted ended up exacerbating conflict and disrupting peace talks that were going on with Iran, the Palestinians, and Israel. And just something I was wondering was that since it would seem counterintuitive that increasing business access to Iran would lead to more war rather than more incentive to gain peace, I was wondering how the sanctions in Iran really did lead to increased violence or disrupted peace talks, and just anything related to that.
All right, last one in this round. A student first. Let's take over there.
Hi, I'm Joseph Rubenstein. So my question is, first of all, how does this conflict kind of relate to the recent proposal by Mahmoud Abbas with regards to the United Nations and the Palestinian statehood? And also, as a side note, why is it that people focus very heavily on Israeli rhetoric when Palestinian rhetoric is often extreme as well?
Fine, thank you very much. Now we'll move to the other side. So who wants to start? Would you like to start, Dr. Gindi?
You might want to address the first one on the impact of Hamas in the PA, because that might be central.
Yeah. First of all, thank you all for being here. This is a very timely subject, and unfortunately, I think all of us have a greater sense of urgency because of what's happened. I mean, it's unfortunate, the circumstances rather than the urgency. As to the question of the impact on Palestinian politics, I think the impact has been somewhat counterintuitive. There was a sense, even amongst, there was a discussion that I had with my colleagues at Brookings and around Washington, and there was a sense by some, and I think this was part of the Israeli calculation, that Hamas would be dealt such a heavy blow this time around. This time would be different. And that, I heard expressions like Hamas would be pulverized, Hamas would be, we can use different verbs. And yet I instinctively knew what Shibley said, that there would be no winners, that Israel, of course, would do more damage in human and material terms, but it would not win. It's impossible to win, simply because you cannot eliminate a force like Hamas entirely, because it's a part of Palestinian social and political fabric, whether we like what they say or not. Hamas began this conflict from a position of unprecedented weakness. It was isolated in the region, it had no friends, it was blockaded, it was financially bankrupt, and politically on the ropes, to the extent that it went to the PA and said, we'll accept whatever terms you have for Palestinian reconciliation, we're willing to give up our governmental control over Gaza, and here you go. And they went from that position to the position that Shibley alluded to, or someone alluded to in the most recent poll, in which they are politically on the ascendant again, in a way that we haven't seen really since they won an electoral victory in 2006. And I think that was very much part of their calculation as to why they were prepared to take certain risks and sustain certain damage both to them and to Palestinians in Gaza, I think they understood that they politically stood to gain from at least not backing down from a conflict. So you have the situation where Hamas went from being weak to being much more, not just stronger, but more consolidated in its position inside Palestinian politics. And the reverse is true, I think, of the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah, which went from a position, I wouldn't call it strength, but a position of at least of being somewhat comfortable, to one where they are now on the defensive. Mahmoud Abbas has been undermined, I think, more than any other political figure over the past 2 months of this conflict. So we have a situation where the Palestinian leadership is weakened and Hamas is actually strengthened.
Thank you. Sure, go ahead.
Yes. I think that very important that the voices that we didn't hear from Gaza Strip, because after the war ended and the ceasefire started, we heard Ismail Haniyeh, Sami Abu Zuhri, Khaled Mash'al, all the other spokesmen of Hamas, the leaders of Hamas. Ismail Haniyeh, the previous prime minister, just went through and threw candies over the people, and they talk about a victory, hilarious victory. But the other voices in Gaza, and I think that the majority of the Gaza people tired from the war, from what Hamas brought to Gaza Strip. Hamas, after the election in 2006, they promised them, the Palestinian in Gaza Strip, and not in only the Gaza Strip, reform and change. Reform and change because the Palestinians, most of them, were tired from the corruption of PLO. And Hamas promised them change, but the change didn't come. Since 2006 until now, more than 3,500 Palestinians were killed by the Israeli, by the other offensive and other war between the Hamas and Israel. More than 10,000 Palestinians were injured, and the destruction of Gaza, unbelievable. So if you ask the people from Gaza, not the leadership, not people who supported Hamas, what they want to live. They want to survive. I think this is the question. And according to Mahmoud al-Abbas, the PLO in the West Bank, you can hear the other people, especially the youth people in the West Bank, they are looking for another leadership, a different leadership, not Abbas, not PLO, not Hamas, something else. They are talking about other people, other figures in the West Bank, like Mustafa Barghouti, but I think that Palestinians still looking for another leadership to lead them to another horizon for the future.
Thank you, Shlomi. Professor Bendor, do you want to react to any of the questions that were raised?
Yes. Actually, although I'm a law professor, I don't believe that the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis are, in essence, a legal conflict. But there was one question relevant to law as to the calls in Israel for genocide. I not know specifically about what the parliament member Feiglin said, but definitely there were a lot of calls in Israel for genocide, and although in Israel there's wide freedom of expression, quite similar to the American law, this is problematic, this is not legal, and as far as I know, maybe not enough, but Israeli police investigates, not all of course, but part of those calls which are hate speech and cannot be part of freedom of expression in Israel, and all the rest, as I said, is not legal.
Thank you. Shibley, please.
Yeah, I actually want to relate to this a little bit, but anyway, start with Evan's question about empathy and lack of empathy, because it also goes into incitement and hate speech on both sides and what happens in that environment. We see a lot of it in conflict, in all conflict, not just this one. But in this particular case, it was really almost unusual even for the Israelis and Palestinians. Particularly on the Israeli side, you always have hate speech on the Palestinian side too. It's both sides, but I think it was how acceptable to the mainstream it became. And what we saw particularly, I mean, forget about that particular statement, although he called about leveling all of Gaza and putting all of Palestinians in tents on the beach or something along that line. It was actually a proposal like that. But there were people who were highly respected in the mainstream, like Ireland, who was the national security advisor, who was clearly one of the mainstream thoughtful strategic thinkers in Israel, who wrote an article saying there's no such thing as civilian casualties. And now, you know, that's quite extreme in the context of the mainstream. You always have people like that, and certainly terrorists make that argument, that there's no such thing as civilian casualties. That's why we can attack civilians at will. But we've seen that. Now, I don't want to explain it all away by saying it's like every other conflict. There are some particularities here, and there is a certain asymmetry here in the conflict. But I want to just refer to the empathy question, because I've done research on it. And I know that what happens here in dehumanization, I mean, you know, why is it that seemingly reasonable people, sometimes people who think of themselves liberal and moral and caring about human rights, who suddenly go blind and dehumanize the other in conflict? And we see this on both sides. I've done a lot of it. We've tested it on the capacity for people to tolerate civilian casualties of the other, people dealing with the atrocity of the other, like how Arabs will react to the Holocaust, how you know, Israelis react to the you know, the Nakba for the Palestinians, and so forth. And what we found is that it is principally a function of their assessment of the prospects of peace or war. So for example, in the 1990s, when Israelis and Palestinians early on after Oslo thought peace was coming, they had a capacity to empathize. So when you asked Israelis, do you support expelling Palestinians from their home? You got very few people who said yes. When you asked Palestinians, do you support terrorism against Israelis? Overwhelming majority said no. Now, fast forward after collapse of negotiations, and then people make an assessment that war is more likely than peace, then they want to harden their hearts to fight the good fight. And they don't want to fight if, you know, it's very hard to kill people if you think of yourself as a human being, except if you demonize them. Demonization, in a way, is a strategy of conflict. And one of the most you know, interesting commentaries that are made in the Israel-Palestine question was a statement by the late Moshe Dayan, former defense minister of Israel, a very memorable eulogy in 1956 when in the funeral of an Israeli who was killed by Palestinian guerrillas from Gaza in 1956. And it had two parts to it. It was one part which seemed like to totally empathize, of saying, I understand why they want to kill, why they hate, because they watch us build on their lands under their noses while they're rotting in Gaza. So total empathy in the eulogy. And then he says, but that means they're going to try to kill us, and we can't help it. And we can't drop, you know, that, and we have to harden ourselves to fight the fight that we have to fight. So it's kind of a very strange logic that you find. Some people deal with it better than others, but a lot of it, not all of it, and there are obviously people who are hateful on both sides, who will be hateful no matter what, who will not accept peace, but we do know that that hardening, that demonization, that absence of empathy is very much a function of the loss of hope in peace and expecting that you're going to have to fight the battle. And that's why I always believed that if you don't have a way to bring hope, that's what you're going to end up with. It's disaster for both sides.
Thank you, Shibley. Let's take the second round. Please.
Loud enough. I'm a loud teacher. Thank you. We're talking about this bottom-up and top-down approach to bringing peace and ending the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and we had differing views, in a friendly way, of course, in the panel about which approach seems to work better. As a media scholar, I've been monitoring a lot of the discourses and rhetoric that has been exchanged between both sides on the internet and social media platforms. And yes, there's a lot of horrific, really, really ugly rhetoric on both sides. But there were also some whispering voices of sensibility, rationality, reconciliation, coming to a middle ground, accepting the humanization of the other, and rejecting violence. My question and comment is, what can we really do in order to bring about this tipping point when these whispering, moderate, mild, rational voices on both sides can really become amplified, can become louder, in order to bring about the tipping point, to move in the direction of non-violent resolution and reconciliation, rather than the discourse of war and military confrontation that we have been witnessing over and over again. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Jeffrey Herf, professor of history, modern European history in the history department here at the university. The panel, either intentionally or not, has given an impression of moral equivalence between Hamas and the government of Israel. And I want to object to that very strenuously. While one can find some comments by people in public life in Israel, it's a free society after all, that say regrettable things, the government of Israel has never said anything remotely approaching comments about extermination and genocide of the Palestinians. I mean, that is essentially a blood libel. It's a lie. There are 2 points I want to raise. First is the question of Arab political culture. I wrote a piece in the American Interest earlier this month reminding people of what is in the Hamas Charter, which is a document that repeats some of the scurrilous anti-Semitic hatreds of European history and adds some Islamic context to it. Hisham Melam, in a very important article in Al Arabiya last week, talked about Arab political culture having produced ISIS with a penchant for conspiracy theories. And I wondered what the panel had to say about the disaster now that is much of the Arab world, and Hamas is part of that disaster. To Shlomo Eldar, I'd like to ask you if you've read Mati Friedman's recent piece about reporting from Gaza, and what you have to say about the job that the media has done reporting on the war.
Thank you very much. That piece described the bias that is being created by foreign journalists who cover the story from Gaza for different reasons, both the attitudes of the Hamas authorities, how they manipulate the journalists there, and the positions of editors in the European or American press that do not want to write negative things on Hamas, but more on Israel. And generally speaking, the article, which has become viral, says that the international media really take Israel out of the context compared to other cases. For example, he said somewhere that in 2013, the number of homicide in 1 month in Chicago was 42, which was the same number that happened for a year in Israel. So why did you read about Israel and the Palestinians so much as you read about Chicago as you read about Israel? Or the number of women that were killed in 1 year, last year in Pakistan, were 1,600. How much coverage was there compared to the coverage about the war in Gaza? So the article is a very strong criticism of the way the international media covers the conflict. And Shlomi, we'll take two or three more questions and then you can answer it all. Yes, please.
Yeah. I have the mic. All right. Yeah, my name is Moran Stern. I'm from the graduate program in government and politics. First of all, a comment. I don't know who read the piece of Feiglin, because I did. He did not use the word extermination. As lunatic as he is as a politician, he had a different idea, but he did not use this word. So it's very, very important to be accurate when you comment on someone's writing. One thing. The second, then I have two more technical questions. One to Professor Ariel Bendor. So the Israeli narrative is, look, in 2005, Israel has disengaged from Gaza. The Gazans were left alone, went for elections, voted Hamas. Israel is not there anymore, unlike the story of the West Bank. Comes the Palmer report following the flotilla, the Turkish flotilla, says the siege over Gaza is legal internationally, from the international law perspective. I want to ask you, what is the situation today? Do we have a siege? Is it legal? What's going on there? The second thing which I'd like to ask is, adding up to your introduction, Professor Peri, is that you talked about this vicious circle. Once every 3 times in 6 years we have a conflict in Gaza. But what I'm missing from what I read, and I would be very interested, anyone in the panel, is that the last phase always of the conflict between Israel and particularly the Gazans in the last 6 years is that once the fire is seized, you see the Qataris, the Americans, the Europeans, whoever, with the briefcases of cash going into Gaza, and don't create any accountability on the part of the Palestinians, saying, we will help to reconstruct, but you better be a bit more accountable to your future. And what we end up is with a civilian society that is in a very poor condition. So I'm missing these stick and carrots when it comes to the development post-conflict. And I would very much interested to hear your take on that.
Thank you.
My name is Gary Berman. And my question is simple, but I'm not sure the answer is so simple. And that is, what would Israel have to agree to have peace with Hamas?
Thank you. The last one. You have the mic, so
yeah, thanks.
Go ahead.
I wanted to piggyback on the voices of reconciliation that were mentioned earlier. In a New York Times article a few months back when Protective Edge was still going, there was an article that characterized a lot of the Arab nations kind of interacting with the conflict as deafeningly silent on the whole conflict. Is this the beginning of a new attitude towards Israel in these countries, and what role will Egypt post-revolution play in it?
Fine. So we have collected enough questions and comments for this round. Who will start? Shlomi, you will start now? Okay. Go ahead.
Many questions that I have to answer, but I think, first of all, they are covering in Gaza Strip. I covered Gaza for Israeli Channel 10 and Channel 1 over 20 years. Since the Palestinian Authority was established, even before, and after the military coup of Hamas in Gaza Strip in June 2007, I couldn't enter anymore to Gaza Strip. And in Channel 10, where I was working for, we hired a Palestinian crew to cover the stories in Gaza Strip and to send the material, the rushes, to the Israeli channel by satellite. And usually I edit all the materials that I've got from Gaza Strip. But what happened since 2007, after the military coup of Gaza, in Gaza Strip, that my team, my crew, couldn't say anything against Hamas, nothing. They couldn't criticize anything about Hamas did. Not in the checkpoints, not in Rafah border, nothing. Even a corruption of Hamas. And just imagine, what can we say about the other reporters during a war that can't say, or couldn't say, that Hamas and other organizations launching rockets behind the kids' gardens, schools, hospitals, and using the Palestinian population as a human shelter. This is the voices that we didn't hear, but all of us knew. And the difficulties of the Israelis during this war. We heard about 2,200 Palestinians were killed because they were, most of them, a human shelter. And we couldn't hear nothing about it from the other reporters in Gaza Strip, not the Palestinian, of course not the Palestinian, but over the foreign media. I would like to answer to the question what Israel would accept to peace with Hamas.
Not necessarily what they would accept, what would Hamas demand they agree to?
Oh, Hamas is a religious organization, movement, can't accept Israel. Can't accept the existence of Israel at all, because they are religious people, they are religious organization, religious movement. For them, for even the moderate leaders of Hamas, like Ismail Haniyeh, that I'm using to say that he was moderate, but I'm not sure what it is now. They can't accept Israel because if they recognize Israel, they can be considered by traitors. Because you forgive the Palestinian land, so you can't afford yourself to be a betrayer. So over the years, Hamas movement, especially after the election, especially after Hamas were elected in the election, tried to figure out how to deal with the Hamas charter, who called to destroy Israel, and the reality. And they found themselves, they can't fulfill the charter of Hamas because Israel is strong, and the reality is much complicated. For example, even Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, who established a Hamas movement in 2002, agreed to a ceasefire, hudna, with Israel. It's unacceptable for them to deal with Israel for ceasefire. If you deal with Israel for the ceasefire, then you neglected the jihad. And what Hamas accepts from Israel, I think over the years when I followed even especially the political group, the political wings of Hamas, they try to find any procedures with the Israelis, not peace, procedures. Live and let live. But unfortunately, what happened, and I will end it now, what happened to Hamas, that the military wings took control over the movement. And we saw it especially now in this war in Gaza Strip. They took control and decided everything. The military group, not the leadership. Even Khaled Mashal, the leader of Hamas, said, I think 2 days ago, that he knows nothing about the kidnapping of the Israeli teenagers. He just know lately during the war. So the military wings decide everything for Hamas movement, and I think this is the most difficult of Hamas today.
Shlomo, Khaled, would you like to react to that in addition to the other questions that you were asked? Yeah. Please do.
I have a different perspective on Hamas as someone who's very critical of Hamas and very critical of the Palestinian Authority. And I agree with the statement that Hamas is a product of the disastrous nature of Arab politics. But I would also add that Mahmoud Abbas and Fatah are also part of the same disastrous Arab political culture as Hamas is. And I would actually submit that Hamas is not all that different from Fatah in both politics and in terms of its actual immediate political objectives. Hamas is a political body. Yes, it's true, it's ideological. It's true that it is religious. But that's also true of political actors in Israel, who in fact are in government. There are religious nationalists who are part of the cabinet. And I would argue that Hamas is no more and no less extreme, if that's the term that we want to use, than many of those in the Israeli government. If we want to talk about Hamas charter as abhorrent as it is, then we must also talk about the Likud party charter. Then we must also talk about the reality is that there is a conflict between two peoples. There is not a conflict between Hamas and Israel. There's a conflict, a 100-year conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. And on that score, I would differ with Yoram on something he mentioned at the outset, which is this is the beginning of the Israel-Palestinian conflict was not the first Intifada. It was the Balfour Declaration in 1917. Okay, this is a 100-year conflict, and it has had many iterations and many various actors on both sides who've come and gone. What would it take for Hamas to stop playing the destructive role that it has playing? I would argue ending the occupation. Fundamentally, Hamas, regardless of what is in its party charter, it is a political organization. It is motivated by a desire for political power, primarily through elections, and it is not going to stake out positions that are far outside the Palestinian political mainstream. The vast majority of Palestinians, I won't say the vast majority, a slim plurality of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza still believe that a two-state solution is the least worst option, not the best option, but the least worst of available options. That creates a window. Hamas has made a number of signals over the years by various leaders. You can discount them as not sincere, as smoke and mirrors, that's fine, but the reality is that they have at least paid lip service to a solution that rests on the creation of a Palestinian state within the 1967 borders. There are, by the same token, fine, we can dismiss that as insincere, but you also have those inside the Israeli government who openly reject a two-state solution, who say we will never accept a Palestinian state. And in fact, they are ministers in this government. Not to mention the extremists who call for ethnically cleansing Gaza and erasing the line completely between civilians and combatants. They are part and parcel of Israeli political culture. And they're a reality. Or the Americans or anyone else, we cannot dictate who can participate inside Israeli politics, who is beyond the pale. That's for Israelis to decide. In the same way, Israel and the United States don't get to decide who can participate in Palestinian politics. Hamas is a political movement. It has its core constituency, and it has won elections in the past. That at least earns it the right to be part of the Palestinian social and political fabric, regardless of whether we like it or not, and let the chips fall where they may. In the same way that you have a government in Israel that openly rejects a peaceful settlement and that is prepared to kill, 2,200 people in order to maintain a blockade on Gaza, then
to stop the Qassam rockets. To stop the Qassam rockets.
Right, and the Qassam rockets have a source, right? They don't come out of thin air. Rockets are a tactical means to an end. And the rockets, the violence more generally, is a function of the occupation. In the case of Gaza, of the 8-year blockade. Without...
Sorry, I just want to put... Just a second. We have the entire evening. I want to push you on one topic to understand it better. One of the major arguments of the Israeli side is that you cannot compare between the Hamas and the PLO because the PLO were seculars and therefore, by definition, more flexible. Hamas are extreme religious and therefore they cannot compromise. What's your answer to that?
They are what they are. Whether we can label them as extremist, as abhorrent, as terrible, as nice, whatever adjectives we use, they exist. and they're a part of Palestinian political culture and political life, in the same way that the Muslim Brotherhood was part of Egyptian political life. And by the way, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, when they were elected, was able to maintain the peace treaty with Israel, didn't abrogate it, despite having the identical, Hamas is a part of the Muslim Brotherhood. It has the same ideology as the Muslim Brotherhood. It it's not more anti-Israel than the Muslim Brotherhood.
Okay.
So the bottom line is you have religious fundamentalists in government in Israel who are part of the process. I may consider them extremists, but what I think is irrelevant, because they're a part of political life in Israel.
Yes, but you didn't say...
Short one.
Only a short one.
Go ahead.
That in
Shibley.
2007, Hamas took control over Gaza in a military coup and kicked out all the PLO from Gaza Strip with no election. And I agree that Hamas is a political body. It's a political party, but it's a party, a movement with an army, their own army. And this is a different.
Just like every Palestinian faction in the history of the Palestinian
The
national
Kurds don't
movement.
have any army.
No, don't compare.
Because
don't
they
compare.
have a state, and the state has an army, and the state has a government. Every Palestinian faction in the history of the Palestinian national movement has had an armed wing, including Fatah. And to this day, Fatah still has an armed wing.
Okay, thanks. Shibley, and then we'll ask more questions.
Liberation movements. They have a military wing and a political wing.
Well, I came from the
Shlomi.
the media.
Thank you for
Go
the
ahead.
legal question. I don't want
Shibley. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I don't want to feel unemployed here.
No, I'm from the different fields. So
No, you are right. As I said, this is not a illegal conflict. I said this. Israel has a right to defend itself, and this may include defend itself by proportional means. This may include, in specific circumstances, also a sort of blockade. But this gives rise, at the same time, also for basic duties. And I know that some of my colleagues at the law school of Bar Ilan, Professor Avi Bell, thinks different than me, but as far as I know, the official standing of the government of Israel is, for instance, that Israel have a duty, a legal duty, to supply water and electricity to Gaza Strip. Because of the blockade, because the circumstances in which, as we know, Gaza Strip is not independent. So Israel also, because of the blockade, have also some duties. Maybe, and as I said, I don't know all the details. Maybe Israel doesn't do enough within these duties. But the principle is that the state can defend itself by proportional means, but this security means that also it has some duties to the Gaza Strip.
Thank you. Shibley.
I want to make two quick points. One is on the remarks by my esteemed colleague, Professor Harf, on moral equivalency. And it's kind of interesting that I started by saying, well, we're not going to moralize, but I guess we're moralizing anyway. But I want to just say, without taking my own position, that this is exactly the kind of comment I get all over the Arab world, who's saying, what's the moral equivalency? You're talking about a people under occupation, or people under blockade for 8 years, or people have no rights, or people who have struggled and haven't done it, and you're talking about a big, powerful state. Where's the moral equivalency? And you're pretending like they're equal. So I just want to put that out there for you to think about when you're thinking about moral. How you balance it, it's up to you. But it's there. You hear it even more on the Arab side that there's no moral equivalency. You hear it actually internationally in Europe. You go say there's no moral equivalency. That's an argument to be had. I don't think we're the best people to pass judgment because it's based on relative moral standards that we may all hold. I have mine. I don't impose them on others. But I want to say something about Hamas. And I don't know, actually. I go back and forth. Can Hamas really accept Israel? I don't think they're ISIS, by the way. I mean, I think they're principally a national movement with religious agenda. And obviously, they want to have a religious state, something that, you know, obviously I don't want to see. And they use violence against civilians, something I don't want to see, and most of us don't want to see. And I don't know whether or not they would reconcile themselves with Israel. But here's the point. Their support has been mostly a function of whether they can deliver or not an end to occupation. We've seen what happened after Oslo. Their numbers were below 20%. And guess what? You know, the peace process collapsed before Hamas got into the fight with Israel. And if I remember correctly, when our Secretary of State went to Congress to explain why the negotiation failed, not with Hamas, but with Mahmoud Abbas, a man who, whatever you think of him, as a leader, he at least opposed the use of violence at least since 2000 when there was the second intifada, when Arafat himself embraced it, he took the position against it. And if I recall correctly, Secretary Kerry said, poof, it was the settlement, stupid, that brought it down. So I think this is not, the reality of it is, you see how Hamas's prospects are mostly a function of the prospects of peace. So the whole idea of American diplomacy was that if we put something on the table to the Palestinian public that they can say, this is going to end occupation, you're going to have a state, they will reject Hamas. I believe they would. Just like I don't really, a lot of people point to the Israeli government officials and say, well, they're deliberately saying we don't believe in two-state solution. Members of the government of Israel saying we don't believe in two-state solution. I find it problematic. I can't say I don't find it problematic, but the bottom line is that it shouldn't stop you from trying. The idea is you put something on the table that the Israeli public can't say no to because it's a world of bad options. And then you test them. And you see whether those people who say we don't want it can survive the day. And so that's the idea here. The idea is don't just focus on those rejectionists and think that they're there because the public loves them, but they're there because you're not putting an alternative option on the table. And that's the way we have to see it.
Thank you very much. Yes, please. Yeah.
All right, I'm a student. I'm a sophomore. My name's Hannah. Thank you. Okay. My question was for a comment that was just made saying that, you know, is it really that much different than people in the Israeli government? And I understand that wherever you go, there will be extremists on any spectrum, but it seems to me, as mentioned before, that in Hamas's charter, it literally calls for destruction of the state of Israel. And it's recognized internationally as a terrorist organization. And my question is, how can you draw a comparison between an entire group that makes it its mission to wipe Israel off the map versus a few people here and there in the government, whereas Hamas uses its civilians as a human shield, and the Iron Dome is used by the IDF to protect its citizens.
Fine, thank you very much. Over there, please. The lady over there.
Yep.
Sorry.
Hi. Before Hamas was ever there was occupation and illegal settlements happening, which continue to happen. And as far as the fairness of it goes, when the 3 Israelis were kidnapped, sadly, and killed, everyone knew their name, their age, everything about them. Yeah. Whenever Palestinians die, you know nothing about them. I had 3 cousins of mine who died recently in this war, and they were not used as human shields. There was no Hamas rockets fired anywhere near them. there were no Hamas weapons hidden in the houses of my cousins that were destructed. And I have a cousin who's in critical condition and she cannot get the medical attention that she needs. So if they want, let's say, to help the people, the civilians who are used as human shields, why do they not allow them to get the medical treatment that they need? Why must all those people die for the terrorists that they're trying to get? I don't ever think it's justified for the person next to me to die because I did something wrong. So when you have people like Eilat Shaked, which is a political leader in Israel, calling for the death of the little terrorist snakes and their mothers, with thousands of people liking her comments and following her, it creates a very distinct line between Palestinian and Jew when that was never there to begin with. My father grew up there, and he had plenty of Jewish friends, and that just tears them apart. And it's not just a line like that.
Thank you very much for your words. We do share your pain. Please. Yeah.
Okay. First, I speak again. Go for it.
So as someone who's a complete outsider to this conflict entirely, I'm a bioengineering student actually, I've never found this to be, or I've never had a personal stake in this conflict, but I've always had a personal curiosity. And this is a rather elementary question to which I've never found a satisfying answer, which is, what exactly is a win for each side? We always talk, I hear a lot of talk for loss, and I want to know, or truly understand, like, what is a win, and what is the practicality of that? What are the legal terms? And also, there seems to be a lot of talk regarding the political bodies, but I never could understand what is a win in terms of the people that are actually truly being affected. We hear a lot of talk regarding the extremist voices between both governments, or however you would choose to define these political entities. But I feel like there's a lot more talk amongst the people, and I want to know, what do they consider a win?
Thank you. Last one in this round, please.
Hi, I'm Greg. I'm a student at the university. I heard Dr. El-Jindi say that Hamas is a political movement and that its main thing is political power, and that they were willing to take certain risks. So if by risks you mean like using civilians as human shields, then how can they be recognized as rational political actors? Like, 'cause I don't believe that a rational political actor would want to use someone as a human shield. So that's just my main question.
Thank you. Ariel, do you want to answer first the issue of civilians who suffer more than anybody else in this particular war?
Well,
this is I guess this is the point which caused most problems to everybody. And
yes.
we have to hear a good answer to that.
Well, nobody, I think, can deny that the Palestinian civilians in Gaza suffered more than Israelis. Myself, I came from Israel about 3 weeks ago. I ran to the shelter with my wife and children, but, well, my life was quite normal, not as such in Gaza Strip, and we all saw and heard what happened there. As I said, the problem, I don't believe it's really a legal problem, and I don't think that there are a lot of countries that if there will be bombings on states, maybe New York or Washington, will do nothing because there are civilians in the places from where the bombings came. So probably we can understand international law as far as the security means are proportional as allowing such bombings from the side of Israel. But as I said, I don't think that the court of law can give a good solution for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It should be a political, not a legal solution.
Let me add one word on that, because this is the field that I've been researching for the last 2 years, and I'm writing a book on the new wars. One of the major ingredients of the new wars, they have very many names, war of fourth generation, asymmetrical warfare, etc., is that they are going to be conducted within civilian population. If anybody thinks that we can change it, he or she are wrong. And it's going to be worse and worse in the future rounds, whether it's the Middle East or somewhere else. This is going to be the face of war. So in such wars, you have a very high level of collateral damage. And the term proportionality is very vague. The question is, what are the intentions of both sides? From that point of view, I tend to accept the position of the Israeli military that they do not want to hit civilians, and yet, if they think twice, if I'm going to sacrifice my soldiers or take a lower level of cautiousness and let civilians on the other side die, I will do that. The Israeli military has been criticized by the Israeli people for not taking enough precautions for the Israeli soldiers. So the pressure on the Israeli military is from the right.
And also that Israel didn't win the war.
So
it wasn't
this is where they stand.
A lot of Israelis will think.
Right. Had there been many cases like the story that you tell, that people who are totally unrelated to the war suffered? Of course there were. What I want to argue is that it will be very difficult to find. How many of them? But we should expect to see more of that in the future, anywhere. And therefore, what we should do as human beings is to try to prevent wars. Shibley.
I think that we all may disagree on the moral standards here. And I'm not going to tell you what my moral standards are, but I'm going to tell you something different, which is I was on a board of a major human rights organization, one of the largest in the world. And if I were wearing that hat, I would have to say exactly what they said, that both Israel and Hamas committed war crimes in the Gaza war. And why would I make that from that point of view of human rights law? I don't think it's relative. I think that in general, it's not enough to have to just be firing in an area where you know there is somebody who's firing at you. You have to take particular precaution to prevent civilian casualties, and you can't be indiscriminate in your shelling. I mean, that's what Hamas claims, that they're actually shooting really military targets. Just happen that the rockets are pretty lousy and they hit civilians, all right? Well, of course, they know they're going to hit civilians. Even if they were right, they're still committing war crimes by virtue of unnecessarily putting civilians at risk. And if you look at pictures of what happened in that war, when you have a leveling of a whole neighborhood like Shujaiya, if you look at bombings that also included UN schools, that led the UN Secretary General, who's pro-American, to say that these were war crimes, that even if Hamas was actually shooting from near the school, inside the school, when you know that there are a large number of casualties there, that's an issue in international law, whatever your moral position is. So you can say, I don't really care about international law, but if you do care about international law, I don't think it's a relative thing, Yoram. I think it's very obvious. I don't think there's any question about it. And I don't think we should pretend. I think we need to face up to it, that this was a huge number of... When you attack an electric power station that puts out the population of a huge population out of electricity for such a long time, when you prevent the water from reaching the population for a long time, when you put people under blockade and they can't even get food, when you can call it collective punishment or whatever it is, I don't think you can pretend that there was no intent in punishing Hamas, yes, by punishing the population that Hamas is ruling or making it difficult for Hamas to rebuild. The assessment is that separate from the casualties of dead and wounded, you have the economic casualties are several times the GDP of Gaza itself, maybe 3, maybe 5 times the GDP of Gaza, something they can't do. And the most recent UN study is it'll probably take them 20 years to repair the damage, which they started with 2 months ago, which was a horrible place that they're trying to get out from under. So, no, but I mean, I think it's very important. I mean, we should put that under the rug. I think this is something, you know, we can say we don't care, that's fine, but I don't think it's a relative thing. I think there are rules of that game. By the rules of that game, both sides have violated international law, undoubtedly.
I don't want to go into back and forth with you, and Khaled wants to say something, but before that, if there's anybody in the audience that wants to relate to what Shibley just said, shortly, to relate to that?
Yes.
Shortly, go ahead. Yeah.
My name is Benjamin Kedem. I'm a math professor in mathematics department here. You know, like, first of all, myself, I've been in 2 wars. You said about your family that got killed, yes? What about my family? Huh? What about my grandfather? What about my uncle? What about my brother-in-law? So, but I want to relate to this, to you. To you, I'm saying this. The rockets, they started the whole thing. If no rockets, there would not be casualties. You understand that? Yes? This is the first thing. The second thing I want to relate to this is in the Israeli population, we have a person like David Grossman. Is there any David Grossman in the Arab world? That's all.
Thank you.
I would like to say I just want to say I think Shibley is right. I think there are standards. There is something called international humanitarian law, and there is something called international human rights law, and there are standards. When I hear the terms moral equivalency and buzzwords like moral clarity, to me, those are red flags. That means essentially those terms are about subterfuge. Those are about obscuring the actual issues of a conflict between 2 peoples. A conflict by definition is when you have 2 or more groups that do and say terrible things to each other. No one is going to convince me that killing 2,200 people, 70 to 80% of whom are civilians, is a righteous, democratic, or moral way to conduct war. Israel claims to have a moral army. Israel claims to be the only democratic state in the region. It should be held to a higher standard than, let's say, Syria, the Syrian regime, or groups like ISIS. So the question of why Israel is sometimes singled out, I think, has to deal with address the issue that Israel itself singles itself out as somehow more moral than others. Well, the proof is in the pudding. And here's the pudding, okay? 70 to 80% of the 2,200 people killed by the moral army of Israel are civilians. 90% of those killed by Hamas, the terrorists, 90% of those killed by the Hamas terrorists are soldiers, okay? Now, I'm not saying that in order to say Hamas is better than Israel, or what I'm telling you is, what I'm saying is, the notion of moral clarity is not at all clear. It is a much more blurry picture than people would like to convey. The fact that you cannot justify, I mean, as Shibley said, when you have that many people who are killed, who are civilians, something is wrong in that equation. And we know, for example, then they should be thankful for the Iron Dome and not have to use such overwhelming, disproportional force. But in fact, we also know that Israel's military doctrine is based on overwhelming, disproportional force. That is the source of its deterrent. We've heard this from many Israeli military analysts. They intentionally use disproportional force. When you use artillery in a highly densely populated area of the world, you are by definition using indiscriminate violence.
Yes, I would like just to mention something that I think that all of us forgot. After the 6th day of this campaign, Israel accepted the ceasefire. After the 6th day, I think on July 16th. And Hamas refused to this ceasefire. Because I followed Hamas movement, I think, since the established of Hamas movement, and I want to tell something very important that I recognize about Hamas today. It's a new creature. Hamas become now more important than the people. Hamas established as a welfare organization by Sheikh Ahmed Yassin and other, the Islamic movement. And they broke the ceasefire 6 days after Israel accepted the Egyptian proposal. So when we are talking about the casualty of Gaza, I'm the last one who can justify, using people or in other side. But I just try to put myself and the Israeli leaders, and believe me, from all my career as a journalist, I criticize the Israeli policy and the territories and Gaza Strip and the settlements and everywhere. But how you can stop the launching of Qassam rockets and Gad rockets and tunnels when Hamas refused to any ceasefire, any proposal. And we are talking about using people as human shields. This is something that we have to understand.
If Hamas is using people as human shields, there should be an investigation into violations.
Okay, let's take them to international law, and they keep launching Qassam rockets. So, and we will solve our problem, and the Israeli audience will stay until the law will recognize the.
A credible investigation of violations by all sides. Who would object to that if you believe
Hamas
in moral
organization
equivalency and moral clarity?
Hamas movement.
As they say on the media, the point is clear.
The point is clear.
Let's go to other point. Yes. The question of the win, what is win? That was not addressed.
I really wonder, to understand, Dr. Khaled, what would you do as as a leader of a democratic country, that keep, getting rockets for 10 years or 12 years already? And I'm from Israel, and my little sisters and brothers, they spend all the summer running to shelters and, being attacked. So what would you do as Israel? You keep saying two groups. Yeah, Israel is not a group. Israel is a democratic country. And yes, the IDF is a moral army, military. I mean, what would you do other than making 250 phone calls before you, target like a house that, that the Hamas is using it as a human shield? What would you do? How would you react if, as a leader, as a state, Israeli state?
I don't know. I'm not. Okay. Sure. Okay.
I mean, it's very easy to criticize.
Yes, my name is Joe Oppenheimer. I was in the Navy during the Vietnam War. I'm emeritus here. There certainly is enough about war that we know. Is this on? There's enough about war that we know, so that we don't have to pick sides to say where are human rights violated. War violates human rights on all sides, by all militaries, at all times. That's the first thing. The second thing is, given that, and given where this immediate conflict started, which was prior to the rockets, And it started, to a very large extent, people said, because there was a political incentive on both sides to escalate from the situation of the breakdown of the peace talks. The question is, what are the political incentives now that can be captured or that do exist or does exist because of the war that can be used to make some political arrangement in the future to prevent further war?
Thank you, thank you. Please. Yeah, yeah. Then one more and then we'll...
Hi, and this will definitely be 2 minutes because my parking is running out in about 5 minutes. My name is Dennis Fritz. I'm an American. I'm Christian. I'm a graduate student. I recently graduated from the School of Public Policy here. I became interested in this issue back in 2003 when I was working in the Pentagon. I was working with some experts may know the name Doug Fife, and I was working with a guy named Shulsky, and I was somewhat concerned about the attitude towards the Arab world. And so I started studying this issue since then. And one of the things I was sure if I want to answer one question, I think somebody asked up there, was that why is there between the United States and Europe some anti-Semitism? I don't think that is the case. I think there's just a change somewhat in the way average Americans, not politicians, but average Americans are feeling about this issue. And I'll give you a classic example. I go around and talk to folks and talk about this issue. One of the worst things your prime minister can say is that, don't ever question me again. Some Americans got upset about that because, in fact, they're talking, wait a minute, $3.5 billion, and oh, by the way, we helped out with $225 million to replace weapons systems. That concerns folks. Then you have Lindsey Graham saying, hey, thank you. We supported Israel, but we couldn't do anything for our people. Well, that concerns overall the American people. So what I would share with you is that the Israeli prime minister and people from Israel need to be careful about how they are portraying this issue and saying, hey, Americans, you don't have a place in this, because we are supporting you. But don't take that for granted. This is what I'm hearing from American people. Now, the other thing I will tell you, when we talk about taking sides, I'm neutral in this, but Israel cannot win, or the Palestinians cannot win. There's no way. So what's going to happen, we have to stop mowing the grass. These Palestinians will have to stop throwing the rockets over there because of the fact Israel's not going anywhere. We all know that. And so we're going to have some way to make peace. The other question I want to say, and I want to ask the group, is I don't see how the U.S. can be a mediator in this when you have us, probably being one-sided. And a lot of the American people are questioning this, that sometimes we do have to question certain motives. And what I would ask to the Palestinians is that how do they feel about the U.S. being a mediator in this?
Okay, thank you very much. We'll take one more question and then we'll let the speakers talk. Oh, so many. We'll stay until morning. All right, the lady over there, yes.
Sorry. Hi, my name's Daniela. I'm a student. I wanted to go back to what some of the panelists said and push back a little bit on what you represented as facts. First of all, I think it's important to realize that the percentages of casualties that were immediately quoted and unquestioned by the UN and other international bodies, in fact, came from a section of the Hamas government that deals with that stuff. But so it was actually from Hamas itself, and there are conflicting numbers. So I don't think that it's necessarily fair to represent those as absolute facts. And the second thing that I wanted to ask and move in a little different direction is that my biggest struggle is that I think some of you talked a lot about what the Palestinian people in general think, and the Israeli population as well. But what I struggle with is, and I see and I do see moderation in the Palestinian population, but it's a little bit frustrating to see how that can come to fruition when Hamas is running through the streets, shooting in the head the people that say anything against them, and how we can promote the moderates and the Palestinian people that legitimately do want peace and want this, because how can they stand up and say they want peace when they fear for their lives from their own government?
Thank you very much. Khaled, you'll be the first, and then the entire panel. Then we'll have another round, and I think that we'll get to 7:30. We'll end by then.
I'm going to hit two birds with one stone and answer the question about what would I do, how would I react, and the question on what political arrangement would prevent a future war, because they have the same answer, and that is address the source of the problem, address the causes of the conflict and not the symptoms of the conflict. If I were advising any leadership, Israeli leadership, Palestinian leadership, the American leadership, I would say, don't dance around the issue, don't procrastinate, address the source of the problem. The source of the problem, the source of this conflict, one of the key sources, is a half-century-old occupation. Gaza is part of that occupation. You can say that Israeli soldiers left, but they continued to control every aspect of Gaza life, everything that came in and out, to the point that Israelis were counting the calories per capita of how many calories per day Gazans needed just simply not to starve. So we, address the core, the very source of the conflict. The rockets, Hamas's charter is not the source of the conflict. Hamas's charter is abhorrent, but it is not the source of the conflict. The source of the conflict is an occupation. A people that wants to exercise self-determination and has been prevented from doing so by Israel. So it is, if I were advising the United States, I would say get Israel to end its occupation. If I'm the Israeli government, I would do what I could to end the occupation. If there's continues to be rockets, then there will be no support internationally or domestically for those who are firing those rockets if the core issues of the conflict are addressed.
Thank you.
Israel, yes, Israel agreed to end the occupation. As I remember, in September 1993, there is called Oslo Agreement in the White House. Shimon Peres, Yitzhak Rabin, Yasser Arafat, and Mahmoud Abbas. And what happened? The Oslo Agreement collapsed. The Oslo Agreement collapsed because of Hamas. Because 2 days after the agreement was signed in the White House, Hamas starting not the suicide bomber, but action against the Israelis. It was starting with a knife, what we called the knife action, and then in 1995, they sent suicide bomber to Tel Aviv, and then to Hadera, to Jerusalem, to Haifa, and the one... No, we are not talking about who killed Yitzhak Rabin. We are talking about who tried to destroy the Oslo Agreement. Really...
Yigal Amir had nothing to do with destroying the Oslo Agreement.
Yigal Amir was part of the extremists of the Israeli, like the Palestinians, many extremists. Yes, of course. Yitzhak Rabin assassinated Yigal Amir assassinated Yitzhak Rabin, but don't blame only Yigal Amir for destroying the Oslo Agreement. The Oslo Agreement destroyed because of Hamas movement that tried to act against the agreement that pushed them out of the Palestinian politics. That's what happened. And when we're talking about who sent the suicide bomber, it's the same Mohammed Def, the head of Izzadil al-Qassam Brigade. They're still acting in Gaza Strip, and he controlled the Hamas movement. So when we are trying to blame someone what happened between the Israelis and Palestinians, I think it was a vision. It was a hope. But the hope was killed or murdered by Hamas movement.
Thank you.
Okay. 2 or 3 sentences. First, I think that at least a lot of international law experts do believe that current international law is not designed to regulate a war or conflict between states and organizations, whether terrorist organizations or other organizations. Second, I think that proportionality means that a state is not allowed to do more than is needed for its security and for defending its cities and citizens. I'm not a politician. I don't want to present here my personal political views, but as I said, as a lawyer, as a professor of law, I think that really the problem is not a legal problem, and I don't think that if we put the conflict before an international court of law or of international court of any sort, this would end the conflict, and the court will decide whether Israel is justified with what it does, or Hamas or the Palestinian Authority. So I think that most of the making this conflict as or talking about this conflict as it was a legal conflict, this is not the issue. This is not a problem. Who is legally right?
Thank you. Now we're going to take 3 questions. So only those who are really burnt inside will not sleep at night if they will not talk. No one. No, you spoke already. You spoke already. So, all right. Number 1. You spoke already?
No? Oh, no.
But he looks like somebody who wants
like
to
say
yes.
Hello, hi. My name is Jake Shapiro. I'm a freshman at the University of Maryland. I'm also the director of Israel Education at Camp Peri, which is a Jewish boys' sleepaway camp at Thermont, Maryland. We've heard Hamas described as a political faction numerous times, and Hamas is the ruling government of Gaza. Gaza is obviously an undeniably atrocious place to live. It's overcrowded, horrible unemployment, shortages of medicine, food, and all this type of stuff. This is a place where, extremism is bred, where you grow up hating Israel and you grow up, blaming other people for the problems. But I want to know where the pressure from both inside of Gaza and also from the international community is on Hamas to be a more effective civil government. Hamas is building these $1 million tunnels. Hamas is neglecting its citizens by using this money that comes into Gaza for other things. Not only does Hamas neglect its citizens, it directly put its citizens in danger by launching from highly populated areas, and also, like we said, by denying ceasefires. So the role of a government is to protect its citizens, to provide services, to guarantee basic rights. Hamas has failed as a civil government, and I think many of the problems in Gaza, obviously a blockade is not an ideal situation to be running a government, but I think that as a civil government, Hamas has failed, and I am curious that the international media is so keen to defend Gaza and so keen to go against Israel, but the international media would do itself a favor by publishing more about Hamas and publishing more about Hamas's shortfalling so that maybe change can happen. And also from inside Gaza, there's a poll today that said that a majority of people still support Hamas inside Gaza. Where is the thinking? When does it come? When does the Arab Spring happen? When does the social media happen where people can rise up and create an effective government to rule themselves?
Thank you. One in the back, over you there. Yes? She stands already.
My name is Noah Meir, and I work at the JCRC, and I must say this was a fascinating panel. A lot of things got my intestines moving. I think my question is to Professor, and I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name, Khaled. You said it's all about the settlements. So my question is as follows.
I didn't say that.
From what I understood, it was that
It said occupation.
Occupation, I'm sorry. Okay. Does that mean that you think that once Israel pulls out of the West Bank and removes the blockade from Gaza, and we won't talk about if it's security, not security, once Israel removes all the settlements and the military is no longer occupying the West Bank and Gaza, that's it? The Palestinians, Hamas, PLO, everyone will recognize the state of Israel and its right to exist as a Jewish state? I just do want to also emphasize 2 points, and I'll make it very quick. 1964 is when the PLO was established. The Palestine Liberation Organization. That was before the Six-Day War. So what were they liberating? So I don't think that the argument is 1967, which I am all for. I have family in the West Bank, and we have arguments every time we meet because I think that they should personally be evacuated because I am for 2 states for 2 people. And I want to make that very clear. And that's, you know, it hits very close to home. But I don't feel that once this ends and the occupation needs to end, that is the end of all the conflict. On the contrary, and 2 things point that. First of all, the anti-Semitism, what we're seeing in the world. People are calling death to the Jews. Hitler didn't finish the job. That's not talking about occupation. And the second thing is, and that was just raised by my former colleague here, raised the question, why isn't anyone pointing any fingers at Hamas? I understand Israel has its own responsibilities, but Israel is, at the end of the day, trying to defend itself against people who are trying to eliminate it.
Thank you. We'll add one more, Eddie, and then you decide which one of you do.
These are expensive.
I'm a professor of human rights and conflict resolution, and I want to address a little bit the dynamics. We are coming to an end, so some reflection for next time. When I look at the audience and the feelings, and even our experts, I come out with the feeling that we are more adversarial than the way we came in. And I'm very sad for that, because you would expect, especially after a war, as somebody said, that this is a time of reflection, how to do things better. So what I'm now thinking, and it's for the next time, there's no time now, we're going to divide such meeting in 2 parts. The first part, we call it, in the language of conflict resolution, the adversarial part, where we want people to air all their grievances, to take out of their system all the accusations that we have towards the other. But then comes the second part. The second part is put yourself on the shoes of the other. Put yourself for a moment and think about it. Maybe some silencing because you have to reflect on small groups. And the last part would be, what can we both do to reduce the level of conflict and use this opportunity that ending a war is an opportunity for a new way for peace. That's it.
Hi. It is such a wonderful ending that I don't want, forgive me, but I don't want others to talk after that. I will let only Shibley to sum up. And it will be the end of that. And you both will be the first one to talk in our next meeting. Sorry. Shibley, go ahead.
Thanks. I just want to say, first of all, it's a pleasure co-hosting this with Yoram. Unlike my good friend and colleague, Eddie, I actually think this tension is a good thing. I think it's a reality. It's what we face. That's what you face through war. If you put it under the rug, I think you're never going to. I understand, but still, you know, in the process of doing a session, I think it's a good thing, and I think it's a healthy thing. We need to. This is what's on people's mind. I think it has to be put out. So I first of all want to tell you I'm grateful to you and to Paul for suggesting this idea, because I think, you know, yeah, we were reacting as panelists, but the reality of it is people spoke their mind, and that's a good thing. I mean, I think we need to put that out. These are difficult and painful issues. They're difficult analytically for us who study war and conflict. That's why we haven't succeeded in resolving it despite our best intention. But they're also difficult morally. And, you know, for me, I wear an expert hat when I'm sitting here or I'm analyzing, but I'm also a citizen like everybody else. And I have my own moral views, and we should all have our moral views, and we should care about what happens. I start on the moral side and the legal side, I start that 2 wrongs don't make a right. And so the fact that we say, well, the Israelis who are occupying, well, that's not going to justify killing innocent civilians. If you start by saying, well, Hamas is shooting the rockets, that's not going to justify your violating human rights of the other. That's the way international humanitarian law works. That's how these international organizations make the decision. Now, you can go from that and say, well, that's not what's going to solve the conflict. I agree. And this is part of a debate that could be had for all of us based on our legal and moral standing. But ultimately, it goes back to what Joe Oppenheimer said, that this is really about, it's not like this is a highly unusual conflict. We know a lot about war. We've been studying it for years. We know that those sort of things do happen to varying degrees. We know that crimes are committed. We know that it's inhumane. We know it's awful. We know people dehumanize. And we have to figure out, how do you move forward? That's the real question that we have. I happen to believe that when this war started, the escalation actually was not by design. I don't think Hamas was looking for this. I don't think the Israeli government was looking for this. I think there were a set of events that drew them into an escalation they didn't want. This is not a war that timing of the war, they knew they were going to probably fight a war, but they weren't ready for it this summer. It reminds me exactly of the 2006 Lebanon war, where neither Hamas and Hezbollah admitted that it made a tactical error in misjudging the Israeli reaction, and the Israelis weren't expecting an escalation. So what happened now is, I think each side, for a variety of political reasons and their sense of what is deterrence, is escalated in a fashion that put them out of, lose the debate. Because in every polity, within, whether it's the Israeli government or within the Hamas leadership, you're going to have people who want war and people who don't want war. As you escalate, the pressure for war increases. We know the escalation theory. This is not something that we've seen it, but I don't believe either side was looking for it. But that's where we are, and we are worse off than before in terms of what needs to be done. But I do think that with all of that, the one thing to take is that 2 months ago, people weren't focused on this issue, and neither Israelis, certainly the Israelis didn't see an urgency to move forward. And somebody asked about how would you move this forward? What I would do is I would use this sense of urgency because a lot of people are confused, whether the Israelis and Palestinians. Israelis want security, they don't have it. Palestinians want independence, they don't have it. And obviously they don't know how to get there because what they've just tried didn't work and what they tried before didn't work. And so the real question is, for international diplomacy, as you move forward, you have to figure out a way to take this energy and uncertainty and sense of insecurity and instability and put it in a direction to move it forward. Obviously, one of the problems that we face is that not only the Israelis and Palestinians are not necessarily in that political reconciliation mood, but there is a vacuum at the level of mediation, in large part because of the American failure up to now, and obviously because of all the other horrible things that are happening in the region. This is not happening all by itself, which makes it a little bit more difficult to address. But nonetheless, as somebody who's dabbled with diplomacy, with all the horrors, I see an urgency that could be turned into a diplomatic opportunity. I'll end with that happy note.
Thank you. Shibley Telhami already thanked Paul Shem. I want to thank our excellent support that we get in organizing the meeting from where is she? She disappeared. Here she is, Samantha Levine. I want to thank the panel, and more than anybody else, I want to thank you for having the patience to sit here for 2 full hours. See you in our next events.